Hi, everyone. This is OGS Executive Director Noel Poirier. By following us on social media and being an OGS member, I know that you support the OGS's efforts to preserve, make accessible, and share genealogical resources, both at the Samuel D. Isley Library and online. I appreciate your support in providing opportunities for genealogical education and enrichment, such as the OGS Conference, the Fall Retreat, online webinars, our new podcast, and more. Your financial support ensures that the OGS can continue promoting genealogy and family history today and in the future. I know I can count on your support as we move forward with the 2024 Building Beyond Annual Appeal and our efforts to continue to grow the OGS's investment funds. If you have already donated to this year's Building Beyond campaign, thank you. If not, please consider donating today. Donations can be securely made online at ogs.org/donate. Thank you for all you do to support your Ohio Genealogical Society. Welcome to Ohio Roots, the official podcast of the Ohio Genealogical Society. Join us as we embark on a captivating journey through Ohio's rich genealogy, history, and abundant resources. Hosted by me, OGS Executive Director Noel Poirier, this podcast brings you insightful conversations with a diverse array of guests, from OGS members, chapter leaders, and staff to renowned genealogists, historians, and influential figures within the genealogical community. Each episode delves into fascinating topics and captivating stories. So grab your headphones, hit that play button, and join us on this enthralling journey of Ohio's roots. In this episode of the Ohio Roots podcast, we speak with historical geographer Timothy G. Anderson. Dr. Anderson is a professor at Ohio University, and he's speaking with us today about why it is Ohio is so significant for settlement early on and what it was about the landscape here that made it attractive for that. We'll talk a little bit about PA Germans versus Germanic settlement, a little bit about Native American and indigenous people, but I think you'll really enjoy this conversation. A proviso at the beginning here, though, we had some issues with our levels for this interview, so there may be times when my voice is a little louder than Timothy Anderson's, but I hope you'll stick with it because it's a great conversation. I want to welcome Tim Anderson to the Ohio Roots podcast. Tim is a professor at Ohio University, and he is a geographer, but he is what is called a historical geographer. Thank you, Tim, for joining us today on the Ohio Roots podcast.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here, and thank you so much for the invitation.
No, we really appreciate it. It's wonderful. We try to get as many diverse voices talking about diverse aspects and subjects in Ohio, both genealogical, but also historical, cultural, things like that. That having you here is great. And that leads me to kind of my first question is one of the first things I saw when I was looking up your bio was you define yourself as a historical geographer. And so I'm curious because I admitted to you before we kind of went live that I had no idea what that meant. And I felt like I'm a pretty well-educated guy. So if you could explain to me and to our listeners, what exactly does a historical geographer do?
Yeah, so I like to think of myself as someone who's kind of midway between being a historian and a geographer. Okay. So I'm interested in, the very simple definition is it's the geography of the past. Okay. And so geography is a discipline academically that really occupies a distinctive niche in the academy, not only in the United States, but in other areas as well. And I suppose that niche is this idea of spatial differentiation on the Earth's surface. Okay. That's really what the academic field of geography is about, but it spans both the physical sciences and the social sciences, and as well these days, especially as the humanities. Okay. So really, you can do a geography of anything. And as long as you're looking at a spatial differentiation, why is this place like this? Why is this region like this and not like another region? And that's, that's really what I'm interested in with regard to the United States is regional identification and regional affiliation and how that came to be over time.
Okay. And by affiliation, you mean cultural, geographical?
Yeah. And not only in terms of how people see themselves, sure. The Midwest, the South, the West, those are all terms that are not really defined by the federal government. I mean, there's
Right.
no such. I mean, there like Appalachia, for example, is defined by the federal government. The
Sure.
Appalachian Regional Commission has a certain number of counties, but like when you say the South, right, that is not something that is defined by the federal government. But definitely, I think everyone would agree that is that's a place in the minds of lots of Americans. And so I'm interested in, okay, well, what is it that defines the South in the minds of people who live there? And especially as a geographer, and I suppose this is the common denominator in geography, is the study of the landscape.
Okay.
And so if you're a physical geographer, you're interested in the physical landscapes. Why do the Hocking Hills in central Ohio look the way they do, and how did that come to be? I'm interested in, and most cultural historical geographers are interested in, the cultural landscape. So the part of our totality of our surroundings that was created by human beings and continues to be created by human beings. And so kind of reading that, I like to think about it like reading a poem, right? So anyone could read a poem by Longfellow and interpret that in different ways. Right?
Sure.
And so cultural geographers interpret the cultural landscape. Why does it look the way it does? And I'm especially interested in the past. How did landscapes evolve over time as created by people?
So it seems like, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, how people identify, like you were saying, the Midwest or the South, that's really a snapshot in time, though, right? Because it really depends on who's living there.
That's right, and it certainly changes over time. I mean, if there's a thing as close to a law in cultural geography, historical geography, it's that the landscape is not static, right? It's continually being shaped. I like to think of it as reading the landscape like peeling back layers of an onion. So here comes a specific group into a region, and they modify the natural environment in which they live by building houses, by building farms, by whatever. And then maybe that group leaves, and another group comes in, and they modify that natural environment in maybe a different way based upon their cultural ideals and traditions and values. And so there are these different sequences of occupancies in the cultural landscape, in any cultural landscape, in any place in the world.
So as we as Americans look at, say, the Midwest, just using that as an example, since we're in Ohio, we look at it as the Midwest because it's in the Midwest part of the United States, right?
Yeah.
I would assume that makes sense, right? If you're an indigenous person pre-European contact in Ohio, what is your relationship spatially to where Ohio is?
Yeah.
Or was there one?
Well, I mean, it's a really complicated history, and I like, to simplify it, you can think about two different groups of Native Americans: Paleo Indians, and then the contemporary Indians, if you will, that were encountered upon in the Columbian exchange, the Columbian contact, in European colonization. So those Paleo Indians, those, in places like most of the Midwest, those would have been people like the Hopewell, the Adena, and then the Fort Ancient peoples. And that dates to around, a Hopewell, that'd be around 900 AD, something like that. But in terms of like a regional affiliation, that's almost impossible to really read into the landscape. We can certainly read into the landscape some of their cultural ideals and traditions based upon the mounds they built, for example, the roads they created. This is a rather relatively recent finding, is that we're finding that there were roads that connected, or at least kind of trade routes that connected places like the Midwest. Also the American Southwest, with Hohokam and Anasazi there, with Middle America. And we found in these mounds, they've found all sorts of trade goods that were not from what's now the United States. They were from probably Middle America, like shark's teeth. I mean, as far as I know, there are no sharks in Ohio, but Obviously there's that. Okay, so there were these Paleo Indians, but then the Native Americans that were encountered upon European contact. In what's now Ohio, you had three main groups: the Shawnee, the Delaware, and the Wyandot. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of the research that's been done on these groups, I think that there was a regional identity. Okay. Certainly, there were linguistic similarities, right? Right. That these folks saw themselves as kind of akin to, or to these other groups living close by. Whether or not the groups like the Shawnee and the Delaware and the Wyandot had any historical affiliation with the Paleo Indians, right? I think the jury's still out on that. Yeah. I think that some archaeologists believe that there were the Shawnee themselves, who are now mostly in Oklahoma, northeast Oklahoma, southwest Missouri. They claim that there's this that there was a unbroken line, if you will, from the Paleo Indians all the way to the present. But I think the jury's still out archaeologically on that.
So I mean, they saw themselves as an interconnected group. Yeah. Generally, right?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, broken down into tribal units. Right. Tribe is simply a group of large groups of extended families who are united by language, probably religious ideals, and kinship. Really, to it as well.
I mean, I've read about mound builders and so I think the Adinas and the Hopewells and things like that. But there is kind of a gap, though, in the landscape between them and this migration of indigenous people from other areas into Ohio, correct?
That's exactly right. Right. There's this gap. And this gap occurs also in the American Southwest, right? You have places like Mesa Verde and Chaco Canyon, Canyon de Chelly, right? These amazing structures and landscapes created by the Hohokam and the Anasazi, who were, by the way, living in the American Southwest at about the same time that the mound builders were in the upper Ohio Valley. Really quite interesting. There's, I don't think, any evidence that there was interaction between these two, but they were living at the same time and building and modifying the landscape in these just amazing ways. The UNESCO site that brings to mind the fact that the some of these mound building sites in Ohio are now ascended to UNESCO site. So that's really interesting. But but there's this gap in the landscape, and this was really interesting in terms of what the first Europeans who encountered these mounds, what they kind of thought about them. I actually have a master's student who's doing his thesis on this very topic, trying to understand, looking at past documents and how those landscapes were incorporated into European and Anglo-American landscapes, like in cemeteries, for example. There are hundreds of cemeteries in Ohio that contain mounds, and those cemetery sites were chosen because of those mounds. I mean, there are Revolutionary War soldiers buried on the top of some of these mounds. So clearly, they were thought of Clearly, they were perceived as being sacred. So and a lot of those sites were remained intact. Purposely, they were not torn down. Others were, but many of them weren't. So there's I think that clearly they thought that they were sacred sites, but they didn't really know by whom they were built. They didn't. I think if you read the writings of some of these early settlers, they're saying
there's some crazy theories out there.
Exactly. Yeah. These were built by some race of giants that lived thousands of years ago. Others would say, oh no, the Indians who are living here now must have built them.
Right. Yeah.
And
and there are some crazier ones than that even.
That's right. Yeah.
It's interesting because a lot of folks who do genealogy in Ohio today, of course, are doing they're European descent.
Yeah.
And one of the first things we always hear when folks talk about their ancestors coming to Ohio, they were coming here for, quote, land. And they use that term land as just this generic kind of, that's what they were coming here for.
Yeah.
What are we talking about when we talk about Ohio as a land, in the sense of its attractiveness to people coming here in the late 18th, early 19th century?
Yeah. So, I think that I always tell my students that the most significant aspect of European colonization of the Americas, not just North America, but the Americas in general, was that they brought the idea of that land was a commodity to be bought and sold. So the commodification of the land was central to the way that Europeans conceived of land in general. It was something.
One of the rationalizations for taking land from indigenous people was they weren't, quote, using it correctly.
Exactly. Yeah. Which in the European mind, in the context, was to farm it.
Right.
In an agricultural society, which the United States was up until just after the Civil War, it was land was the key to wealth. And so when the federal government came into possession of all of this land north and west of the Ohio River after the Revolution, of course, one of the first things that came to mind of what to do with it was to sell it, right? Or at least to facilitate the settlement of it. And of course, by farmers. And this was Jefferson's ideal, of course.
Sure.
Of quote unquote yeoman farmers, that kind of living out on their own as kind of farming the land and with those values associated with that, kind of romanticized, but that was certainly it. But I mean, it was romanticized, but on the other hand, there was a lot of truth, if you will, to this. John Locke, in his recent book, The Good Country, which is about the history of the Midwest, he argues that, there are a lot of these, it's very popular these days to talk about these romanticized images that are ensconced in the landscapes and in the literature and film and such dealing with the Midwest. But he makes the argument that, in fact, by the mid 19th century, the Midwest was home to one of the most, for lack of a better term, progressive societies in the world. In terms of what people were doing out there, farming techniques, et cetera. And as to say nothing of local governments and all sorts of. Like, for example, you think about so many authors came from the Midwest. Sherwood Anderson, Upton Sinclair, right? All these. And all the way up to Garrison Keillor, right? Writing about the Midwest, and all of them kind of had this love-hate affair with it, right?
Yeah.
You read this in Lake Wobegon days, right? Garrison Keillor writes about there's clearly a love for the region, but there's also this sort of underneath that, this kind of making fun of the parochialism of the place, and that kind of the religious and social conservatism of the place. But anyway, it's really fascinating.
Unlock the mysteries of your ancestry with the Ohio Genealogical Society at www.ogs.org. Dive deep into your family's past and connect with fellow enthusiasts. Join us now for exclusive access to expert insights, resources, and a vibrant community. Visit www.ogs.org and start your genealogical journey today. If you enjoy listening to the Ohio Roots podcast, we would really appreciate it if you could go to whatever platform it is that you listen and give us a good review. Reviews help us get more listeners and reach more people with Ohio Roots and what we're trying to do with the Ohio Genealogical Society. So please leave us a nice review, and thanks for listening. I know you do a lot of work with folks of Germanic lineage and Pennsylvania German and Germanic lineage, but how did people from different backgrounds, how did English versus German versus French Canadian versus Catholic versus how did they use the land differently? I mean, would you look at the land? Could you, as a historical geographer, look at the land and say this was settled by a certain type of person?
Sure. Yeah. For example, you bring up like the French settlers. So, and this is, you can see this from space, the effect of this. You look at the upper St. Lawrence Valley, but even places like Detroit, Vincennes, Indiana, the lower Mississippi Valley. If you look at those areas from space, there are these long linear farms that stretch back from the river. And those are called, for lack of a better term by historical geographers, long lots.
Okay.
And those those fields and those shapes were chosen because of the need for everyone to have access to water.
Right.
Because that's how you were getting your agricultural goods, to markets, is via water. Right. So everyone had a farm that had access to the water. So that's that, and some of those landscapes are amazing. I'll just get on Google Earth and just type in, St. Lawrence Valley long lots, and you'll see this. Whereas, Germans, other Northwest Europeans, Scandinavians, they were settling out in places like Iowa, Western Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, and the Great Plains, and they were taking out land that had been surveyed by the federal government into the public land survey system, the so-called township range system, the rectilinear system, and that can be seen from space as well. In fact, that is this rectilinear layout, this checkerboard layout of property boundaries and also road boundaries and things like that, is on a continental scale. And there's no other place in the world that you have such a regularity in the landscape as the United States, at least not at that scale.
And this approach obviously then runs completely counter to the indigenous approach to land use.
That's right. Yeah, exactly.
In terms of just the fluidity of indigenous use of land.
Exactly. Right? Yeah. I mean, indigenous use of land was, and now it depends on where you're talking about. The Eastern Woodlands Indians, those folks probably did stay in places for at least seasonal. There was seasonality there. So in the summer, they'd be in one place. In the winter, they'd be in another place. And there were permanent settlements. And there's certainly evidence of that. Evidence of them modifying the natural environment, through sort of a slash and burn agriculture. The early settlers in places like the Carolinas called those old fields. You'll often find that place name in such and such old fields, and that's what they meant. So it was a place that clearly had been modified. The forests had been cut down. And it was, tobacco, corn was planted. The Plains Indians were almost wholly nomadic. The Shawnee, the Wyandot, the Delaware, in the Ohio Valley, probably somewhere in between. From my reading of the literature, is that they had permanent places. Chillicothe, Ohio, for example, was the Shawnee capital, and that was a large town that was permanently occupied. But and so there was some horticulture going on, growing some corn in the side of the valley there, but they were also supplementing that with hunting gathering. So in terms of their kind of, the main difference between the indigenous kind of claim to land was that it wasn't drawn out on maps. Codified in law, so to speak. It was codified in kind of this mental geography of this is our territory, from this place, or from that sacred mountain there to that sacred river there. It wasn't drawn out on a map. And in terms of there wasn't this abstractness, abstraction of space, and of course that's what the township range grid is abstraction of space on a continental scale. So you asked about the Germans. I think when those Germans got out to places like Ohio, they bought land in rectilinear shapes. So some have argued that public land survey system kind of engendered a rural dispersed settlement pattern where you have a farmer living on their quarter of land, and then down the road a mile, there's another one on their quarter, and down. So it and that towns actually developed later on as market centers and railroad centers. But initially, they were living out in pretty remote areas from one another.
So what separates? I mean, one of the things you mentioned when reading your bio is you talk about Pennsylvania Germans and then Germans.
Yeah.
What is the difference culturally? I mean, that's a whole other discussion, obviously, to get into detail. But briefly, as a historical geographer, what are you looking for differently when you're looking at the landscape between a Pennsylvania German settler and a settler who's maybe right off the boat from Germany, and how they approach the land?
Yeah. Well, I think the Pennsylvania Germans, so, by definition, the Pennsylvania Germans or the Pennsylvania Dutch, right, are the descendants of Germans who came mainly from the Upper Rhine Valley in German-speaking Europe, parts of what's now Southwest Germany, the German-speaking part of Switzerland, and even places like Alsace-and-Lorraine in eastern France, and that settled in during the colonial period, and that's the big difference, right? So these are people who began settling in mainly southeast Pennsylvania, just north and west of Philadelphia, in the 1720s. And so those folks brought with them distinctive folk culture that had a lot of color in it in terms of the artistic expressions of that folk culture, and brought with them distinctive religious traditions. Most of these folks were Protestants. I kind of call them or think of them as what's the word I'm searching for? Kind of escapees from the Protestant Reformation, right? That's happening. That area remained mainly Catholic, and so the Protestant in that part of German-speaking Europe, they ran into a lot of problems and met with a lot of religious intolerance and such, and so they were moving out. North America wasn't the only place they went. A lot of them went to what's now Ukraine and southern Russia. Some went to what's now the Czech Republic, Hungary, Romania. So but a lot made it to North America. And so the Pennsylvania Germans are the descendants of those folks who, and most of them were Lutheran and German Reformed. A minority were pietist members of pietist groups like the Amish, the Mennonites, but they were a distinct numerical minority. I think most Americans, when they think the Pennsylvania Dutch, they think automatically Amish. But really, they were the numerical minority. Most were Lutherans and German Reformed. And they brought with them a distinctive linguistic tradition as well that developed in southeast Pennsylvania, a mix of High German, Low German, and English. So it's kind of a trilingual tradition. The geographers who have written about the Pennsylvania Germans in southeast Pennsylvania argue that they brought with them and instilled in southeast Pennsylvania a very distinctive agricultural tradition that was different from that of their New England neighbors, and was different from their Virginian neighbors. And the difference was that it was an agricultural system that relied not only on growing crops, but also livestock, mainly deer. And so you were doing both. In New England, that agricultural system was quite small scale and localized. In Virginia, it was a monoculture using coerced labor, indentured labor, and then later on slave labor. Whereas in southeast Pennsylvania, this was a full-on market based agricultural economy that was large scale. So large farms, large everything, large barns, distinctive types of barns, because you needed a barn that you could not only store your hay and grain in, but also where you could milk your cows. So you needed a big barn. So those so-called bank barns, those Pennsylvania barns emerged there. And so I think the system in Southeast Pennsylvania was large scale and commercialized, and really, I think a lot of historians, a lot of geographers make the argument that it was the Pennsylvania Germans who really invented what we now think of as the Midwestern agricultural system, which is this system that is, you're growing lots of crops, but most of those crops are not for human consumption; they're for animal consumption. So all that corn in the Midwest, most of that is not being eaten.
Right.
You wouldn't want to eat that corn, that seed corn, and that's being fed to livestock.
Yeah.
And so that system gets imported into central Ohio and then into Indiana, Illinois, and places further west.
I want to talk a little bit about the book, Settling Ohio, First Peoples and Beyond, that you worked on with Brian Schoen. Is that his name?
Shane. Yeah.
Brian Shane. One of the themes that comes across in it is how consequential Ohio is.
Yes.
And I figure we could end on this conversation, I guess. Why was Ohio so consequential in that engagement of cultures and how those cultures came together?
Yeah, so I think in my mind, early 19th century Ohio was one of the most significant places where, first of all, I think it's significant because so many different population groups from the American East were coming together again.
Okay.
During the colonial period, New Englanders really stayed up in New England. Virginians were doing a different thing. These were three different cultures, right, that had set up in the colonial period. But after the Revolutionary War, as the United States comes into possession of all of this territory between basically the Mississippi and the Appalachians, it's that place, it's those places, and Ohio was the very first, where these streams of migrants from the East meet up again. So in Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, there's a north, middle, and south gradation in terms of New Englanders in the northern part, Pennsylvanians in the central part, and Southerners, mainly Virginians and Kentuckians, and what's West Virginia in the south. So southern Indiana is a lot like southern Ohio. Southern Illinois is a lot like southern part of Indiana and Ohio. In terms it was settled mainly by Virginians.
Right.
And you can see that in the landscape, in the cultural landscape. So
is that why no one in Ohio agrees about anything other than the fact that we don't like Michigan?
That's right. Yeah, maybe so. Yeah, Michigan was initially settled by Yankees, right? By New Englanders, or at least a lot of them. I mean, the others as well, but maybe it goes back to that this kind of regional affiliation, but. So I think Ohio was the first place where you see this mixing of these three main population groups.
Right.
Plus, it's a new frontier. There were a series of frontiers over time, and this new frontier was a place where indigenous populations were being encountered by these Anglo-American streams of migrants, and contact that was violent at times. At other times, and this is a rather new paradigm in American history, is kind of rethinking the Native American indigenous kind of worldview and how they saw this, kind of looking at this history from the indigenous point of view. And we have a couple of chapters in the book that touch on this, that try to kind of how would the Miami, how would they view this, right? In terms of their view of how their kind of quote unquote ownership or claim to territory, how that was countered or by European views of land ownership, and the sometimes very sad and violent history. So I think it's important in that way as well. And then I think a third way that's important is that a lot of that Ohio was important in this era is that a lot of the federal government's policies with regard to land and land ownership and land alienation. That what I mean by land alienation is the taking land from the public domain, ownership of the federal government, and putting it in the hands of private individuals. A lot of those policies were worked out in Ohio. I mean, the township range system was first put into place in Ohio, and Ohio was kind of the proving ground for that. So I think Ohio was a proving ground for a lot of these policies on the part of the federal government with regard to land and land ownership, with regard to how do we deal with indigenous populations. And so there was a lot of trial and error going on. And you see that in the cultural landscape as well.
I mean, to me, it's fascinating. I'm looking forward to reading the book. It's my next book on my list. Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today on the Ohio Roots podcast. I think we covered an awful lot. I hope people are listening very carefully to what you had to say, because it was fascinating. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much. And I really enjoyed it.
What a great and interesting conversation, where I think I learned a lot more than I have in a lot of my other conversations so far, just about the early history of Ohio and how all these different cultures came together here to create what we know now today as the state of Ohio, both ethnically and geographically. So I want to thank Timothy Anderson for being with us today on the Ohio Roots podcast. I want to thank you all for listening and putting up with our level issue on this episode. And thank you for listening to this episode of the Ohio Roots podcast.
The Ohio Roots podcast is brought to you by the Ohio Genealogical Society, the premier gateway for discovering your Ohio family history. Hosted by OGS Executive Director Noel Poyer and edited by Luke Poyer. Theme song is Beautiful Ohio, recorded by Bob Stanley and his orchestra in 1944. To learn more about joining the Ohio Genealogical Society, visit www.ogs.org.